What if the gift you buried in your garden was never meant to bloom, but to whisper secrets from the grave? Why would a woman, known for her silence, choose now, after death, to finally speak? And what kind of truth is powerful enough to demand an audience at a funeral? With the living and the dead watching. A single envelope. A whispered request. A legacy soaked in blood and silence. Some truths refuse to stay buried. Stay with us. What comes next will unearth everything. The sun had barely broken through the clouds when Ivy Quinn knelt by the rose garden, her gloved fingers gently patting soil around a new blush pink bloom. The air smelled of earth and memory. She paused, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear, then looked at the delicate roses, as if they could answer a question she hadn't dared to speak aloud. "You'd love these, Aunt Eleanor," she whispered, voice soft as the morning wind. "You always said roses know more than they let on." The plants had been a birthday gift, cuttings from Eleanor Bennett's private garden, trimmed and wrapped in satin ribbon with a handwritten card. "Plant them where the sun hits first. Some things deserve light." The ringing phone shattered the stillness. Ivy flinched, pulled off one glove with her teeth, and answered. "Ivy Quinn." The voice was low, formal. "Yes, this is she. This is James Morton, attorney for Eleanor Bennett. I'm calling with difficult news." There was a pause, too rehearsed to be real. Eleanor passed away in her sleep last night. Peacefully. The silence that followed was unbearable. Ivy didn't speak, didn't breathe. Something inside her, something old and soft, folded in on itself. I just spoke to her 2 days ago." Her voice broke mid-sentence. She was fine. She was laughing. "I know this is sudden," Morton said gently, "but there's something urgent." Eleanor left behind a very specific request. She named you as the sole person allowed to read her final letter, before the entire family, at the memorial. She what? She made it legally binding. "And there's more. I'd like you to come by the office today. There are 2 envelopes waiting for you, one official, and one personal." Ivy stared blankly at the rose in front of her, as if the petals might turn and offer her direction. But they just trembled quietly in the wind. The office of James Morton was carved in stone and silence. Tall windows filtered in pale afternoon light, casting long shadows over framed certificates and mahogany bookshelves. Morton, a sharp-suited man in his 50s with eyes like granite, handed her 2 envelopes. "This," he said, tapping the thinner one, "is the official will." "And the other?" Ivy asked, already feeling the weight of the second envelope. Handwritten cursive on the front reads simply, "For Ivy. Read in private." Morton leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "She wanted you to see it alone. Before anything else." Ivy hesitated, then tucked both envelopes into her bag without opening them. "Later," she thought. "Later when I can breathe." The ride home from Morton's office was a blur of traffic lights and unshed tears. Ivy sat motionless in the back of the cab, fingers tight around the second envelope. The one with her name. The one that felt like a heartbeat in her hands. She didn't wait to get inside. The letter was opened beneath the porch light, as shadows bled across the cracked concrete and wind whispered through the trees. The handwriting was unmistakably Eleanor's, elegant, slanted, and full of authority. "My dearest Ivy. If you're reading this, it means I've finally run out of time. But my voice still has one final place to reach, yours. There is another letter. You will find it in my jewelry box. It is not to be opened until the day of my funeral. The contents are not for your eyes alone, but for the world to see. When the moment comes, stand firm. If you carry this through, I leave everything to you, the estate, the assets, and full ownership of Bennett Industries. Yes, Ivy. All of it. If you choose to walk this path. She lowered the paper slowly, her chest tightening. All of it. She whispered, as if Eleanor might answer from beyond the veil. Why me? But the final lines of the letter offered no comfort, only weight. This is not just an inheritance. It is a reckoning. Do not fear the truth. Let it be spoken through you. That night, under a sky choked with stars, Ivy returned to the estate. She moved through the house like a memory retracing old footsteps. Every hallway hummed with absence. Every room watched her in silence. When she stepped into Eleanor's bedroom, it felt like breaking a spell. The air was thick with lavender and dust. The jewelry box gleamed faintly in the moonlight, a modest thing, carved from cherry wood, with corners worn smooth from decades of touch. She opened it slowly. Pearls. Brooches. A velvet pouch she hadn't seen before. Tucked beneath a false bottom, she found the envelope. Thicker than the last. Heavier. The seal pressed deep in dark red wax, stamped with the old Bennett family crest. She held it up to the light. There was definitely more inside than just a letter. Photographs. Something that rattled like keys. And something stiff, legal paper. Her heart thudded. She sat on the edge of the bed and stared at it for a long time. Her fingers itched to tear the seal, but Eleanor's words echoed louder than the wind outside. Not until the day of my funeral. Ivy exhaled. I'll wait. I promise. She wrapped the envelope in silk and placed it in her bag. Then she walked to the window and looked out at the night. The roses she had planted swayed gently in the garden below. And somewhere deep in the shadows of that house, the truth waited to bloom. Rain tapped gently on the windows of the Bennett Estate Chapel, as if the sky itself was in mourning. Inside, everything was pristine and cold. White lilies lined the aisles. Silver-framed photos of Eleanor watched over the gathering like silent witnesses. The scent of polished wood and aged wealth clung to the air. Ivy stood in front of the mirror, dressed in the navy silk suit Eleanor had always loved. The collar was sharp, the cut elegant, powerful, yet restrained. Around her neck, she wore Eleanor's sapphire brooch, its deep blue catching the light like an unshed tear. She reached into her handbag and touched the envelope. The seal was still unbroken. I hope you know what you're asking of me, she murmured. Because after this, there's no going back. The pews were filled. The Bennett family had arrived in force. Richard Bennett, her adoptive father, sat in the front row, stern, composed, a fortress of reputation and control. His steel gray suit matched his expression. Next to him sat Nathan and Rebecca, his children, Ivy's cousins in name only. Nathan scrolled through his phone with the subtle arrogance of someone who believed he already owned the future. Rebecca whispered with a smirk to a man in a designer trench coat. Scattered throughout the chapel were investment sharks, tech reporters, board members, lawyers, and legacy vultures, each waiting for the final chapter of Eleanor Bennett's empire. And then Ivy rose. The room quieted. The storm outside had stilled, as if the world was holding its breath. She stepped up to the altar, set down the envelope, and faced them. My name is Ivy Quinn, she began, voice steady but tight. I was asked by Eleanor Bennett to read this letter aloud. Her last words. To all of you. She cracked the seal. Silence swallowed the room. To those gathered here today, Ivy read, I thank you. For your presence, and more importantly, for your patience. It has taken 45 years for this truth to find air. You all know me as the chairwoman of Bennett Industries. But you do not know the truth about how that legacy began. You do not know the name Harold Walker. Murmurs spread instantly. Richard shifted in his seat. Harold was a visionary. A mechanical engineer. A dreamer. He co-founded this company with me in 1973. The patents. The engine that started it all. They were his. In 1976, Harold disappeared. Officially, a tragic accident. But I knew the truth. And now, so will you. Ivy's voice trembled slightly. Then hardened. Harold Walker was murdered. And the man responsible is sitting in this room. Gasps broke out like shattering glass. Richard stood halfway from his seat. His name is Richard Bennett. A hush fell like a guillotine. Ivy held up a file, her hand trembling only slightly. This contains Harold's original contract. His signed patent contributions. Forensic evidence. A suppressed autopsy report. Bank transactions, money moved to private accounts within days of Harold's death. I have spent my life watching a lie grow into an empire. I no longer will. This company does not belong to Richard Bennett. It never did. And I am transferring 30% of my shares, effective immediately, to Harold's daughter, Dr. Sarah Walker. The doors at the back of the chapel opened. A woman in her 40s walked in, sharp features, calm fire in her eyes. Sarah Walker. Richard collapsed back into the pew like the floor had been ripped out from under him. You ungrateful little, he started, but his voice cracked. Nathan stood in stunned silence. Rebecca looked like she was about to throw up. One by one, the press, the board, the investors, all turned toward Richard. And in their eyes, there was no doubt. Only disgust. And fear. Richard stood. His face was pale, but his pride made one last attempt to save itself. You think this changes anything? He snapped. You think dragging up ghosts makes you worthy to lead? Ivy stepped down from the altar, walking slowly toward him. No, she said, her voice low and final. But the truth does. He said nothing. Just walked past her, through the stunned crowd, and out into the rain. Back at the altar, Ivy looked out at the faces, some ashamed, some stunned, some secretly thrilled by the fall of a titan. But none of them could deny one thing. The age of secrets was over. Weeks later, word would spread that Richard Bennett had checked into a private clinic. Addiction. Breakdown. Silence. 1 year later, the name Bennett meant something entirely different. Ivy and Sarah had turned the company into a model of transparency, innovation, and fierce ethics. But even as the world praised their vision, Ivy often found herself awake long after midnight, staring at the ocean beyond her apartment balcony. There were questions that still lingered. Not about the company, but about herself. And then, while scanning through legal archives in the firm's digital vault, Sarah paused. Ivy, she called from across the office, brow furrowed. Come look at this. Ivy leaned over the monitor. The document was simple, Eleanor Bennett's death certificate. At first glance, it looked legitimate. But Sarah, ever the perfectionist, zoomed in on the bottom line. This signature. It's off. The registrar listed here. Retired 3 years before this was filed. Ivy stared at the screen, something cold creeping into her spine. Are you saying this document was forged? 2 days later, Ivy stood at the edge of a quiet neighborhood in Maine, in front of a modest cottage painted white with blue shutters. The sea stretched out behind it, waves crashing in the distance like a heartbeat beneath the earth. She had come on a hunch, a single name that kept surfacing in the back corners of Eleanor's correspondence, Mrs. Langley. The door opened slowly. A woman in her 70s, frail but sharp-eyed, looked her up and down. You look just like her, she said, as if they'd already begun the conversation. Come in, child. It's time. The living room smelled of chamomile and dust. Photographs lined the walls, Eleanor in younger years, always smiling at someone behind the lens. Mrs. Langley sat down with a sigh, as if unburdening decades. She asked me to wait. To stay quiet until the storm passed. Ivy didn't speak. She knew what was coming. She's not dead, is she? The woman nodded slowly. No, she isn't. She faked it. The illness, the decline. All staged. She had to disappear to expose Richard without interference. She needed to control the narrative. Ivy's breath caught. Where is she now? She told me to tell you when the time was right. And it's right now. Mrs. Langley reached for an envelope tucked inside her cardigan. She's watching. Waiting. She never stopped. Inside the envelope was an address, no name, no instructions. Just a location on the coast. The cottage stood alone at the cliff's edge, wind howling through the pines behind it. Ivy stood before the door, pulse pounding, one hand clenched at her side. She knocked. And when it opened, time folded. Eleanor stood there, very much alive. Thinner. Older. But her eyes held the same steel, the same fire. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Eleanor whispered, "You found me." They sat together by the fire, the sea churning outside the window. Eleanor poured 2 cups of tea. Her hands shook slightly, but her voice was steady. I always knew you'd come. You were never afraid to seek truth, even when it hurt. Ivy looked at her, voice soft but firm. Why? Why all of this? Why me? Eleanor looked down at her cup. Because you're not who you think you are, Ivy. She reached for an old photo album and turned it to a page marked with a silk ribbon. There it was. A photograph of a man, Harold Walker, smiling beside a woman in a secretary's blouse. And between them, a baby. Swaddled. Wide-eyed. Your mother was Margaret Quinn. She worked for us in the early days. She and Harold loved each other. In secret. You were the result. Ivy stared at the photo, as if it might rewrite everything she'd ever believed. You're telling me Harold Walker was your father? Yes. But why didn't you tell me? Eleanor's voice broke for the first time. Because I was afraid. I couldn't protect Harold. But I could protect you. So I took you in. Hid you under my name. Raised you like my own. I thought, if I gave you time, you'd find your strength. Ivy was quiet for a long time. Then she whispered, I think I did. They sat in silence, the waves crashing like applause. Then Eleanor stood, walked to an old trunk, and lifted out a weathered folder. This is the last of it. The pieces I couldn't show anyone else. She pressed it into Ivy's hands. You've already done more than I ever could. But now, you lead. This is your legacy, not mine. Ivy rose, her eyes glassy. What about you? Eleanor smiled faintly. It's time I disappear for good. No more ghosts. Just truth. And just like that, she walked into the mist outside, her figure vanishing into the fog, leaving Ivy holding the weight of every secret, every sacrifice, and every seed planted in silence. 6 months later, the sign outside the glass towers on 5th Avenue came down. The new one went up quietly, without press conferences or champagne flutes, just the slow, deliberate swing of a crane lifting letters into the sky. Walker Quinn Innovations. The city watched. Investors speculated. The media scrambled to rewrite their headlines. But inside the company walls, there was only clarity. The new name wasn't about branding. It was about restoration. Two names. Two men who had once been erased from history. And now, two women who had fought to write them back in. Ivy stood beside Sarah in the executive boardroom, overlooking the skyline. They had just come out of a shareholder meeting, unanimous support, again. The numbers were soaring, but it wasn't just about revenue. It was about trust. About values. About truth. Sarah leaned against the table, looking over at her partner with a wry smile. Think they'd be proud? Ivy didn't hesitate. They'd be terrified of what we've built. They both laughed, but it was true. The old world would have trembled under the weight of two women rewriting everything. That night, Ivy returned to the estate, what was left of it. She moved through Eleanor's study in silence, the only sound the soft hum of cicadas beyond the window. She carried a single sheet of paper. Her handwriting. Her voice. She opened the drawer beneath Eleanor's old writing desk, the one that once held the very first letter. And she slid this one into place. Then she closed it. But not before whispering the final words to no one. And to Eleanor. Sometimes, truth needs time to rise from deep soil. But if we're brave enough to plant it. She looked out toward the rose garden. Point one day, it will bloom. A letter. A death. A truth long buried. Ivy Quinn didn't just inherit a legacy, she inherited a mission, to unmask the killer, restore justice to a silenced past, and plant the seeds of a future shaped by truth. Through her journey, she uncovers not only hidden crimes, but also the secret of her own identity, a love quietly sacrificed, and the quiet strength of courage, the kind of courage powerful enough to bring even the lost back to life. Because some stories don't end in silence. They begin again. When someone dares to speak.